Hi everyone, welcome. It's Annalisa and Bret from C.A.C. Global Solutions. We are aircraft management specialists, and today we're here for another episode of Storytime with Bret, where Bret is going to share with us an experience, a story, something that he had happened to him in his career as an aircraft maintenance engineer and an airworthiness inspector for different civil aviation authorities. So, Bret, what is the story of today?
Well, today I've got one. It's an interesting one. It's not really about something that happened from a maintenance perspective, and it's not really something that happened from a flight ops perspective, but it's kind of in between and affects both. So I think depending on what perspective you're coming at this from, it'll have implications. It'll have some background to you that I think will maybe hit home a little bit, and hopefully it'll make each other appreciate and think about each other's world a bit more. This one is about precision approaches.
Okay, sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's one particular precision approach that I was actually in the cockpit for. There was a company that I worked for, and we had a Gulfstream G1. It's a large turboprop twin-engine aircraft. And we used to fly freighter services with this aircraft, primarily between a couple larger major cities in Canada. And this one particular story was in the wintertime. And I lived in one city, but I worked in the other city. And so it was quite common for me to hitch a ride home on the airplane for the weekend. The airplane would fly down on Friday night, and it would sit there till Sunday night, and then it would fly back dead, actually Monday morning. And so this one particular time, I was riding jump seat. So for those that don't have an aviation background, the jump seat is typically a seat situated between the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit. And I mean, you're belted in and everything. You're up there with the crew and you're observing everything. Usually you're a little elevated looking out. It's quite a nice experience. I'm sure a lot of people have actually done that. So this one particular Friday night, we were on our way home, and we launched off. It's wintertime. The weather was not good. It was only a 45-minute flight from where we were to the other city. And the weather in the other city was questionable. So we launched out. The pilots were happy that when we got there, the conditions would be good enough to land. They were in the middle of a snowstorm where we were going. And so as we approached, they got the other weather reports, and it was reported as 100 and a quarter, which basically is before you see the runway lights, you're at absolute minimum altitude of 100 feet with a quarter-mile visibility in front of you. And it was quite interesting. I'd never been in this situation before with the crew and on any aircraft. But on approach into Calgary, was the city, everything got real quiet in the cockpit. Coming from a maintenance background, hadn't really experienced this too much and really didn't quite understand. I mean, I grasped the intensity and the gravity of the situation, but all of a sudden it had a whole different meaning. Because at 100 and a quarter, and there was blowing snow reported. You know, I like the pilots are watching the instruments, and you're coming down and down and down. And as we got closer to the ground, you've got one pilot looking out the windshield and one pilot looking at the instruments. The pilot on the instruments actually flying the airplane because you can't see the ground and you're on approach. The pilot looking out the window has his hands on the instruments and he's ready to go, but he's looking for visual sight. And it was interesting because the actual aircraft is calling down the altitude as the radio altimeter as you're coming down, and we're getting closer and closer, and you still can't see the ground. And then all of a sudden, the pilot looking out the window says, "I've got it." And the other pilot, he said, "Okay," and he he looked out as well. He took his eyes off the instruments because now you're there. And I swear, when I saw the runway lights, they were as close below us as they were side to side. I mean, visibility was very poor. I'm not a pilot. I don't know if we should have landed in those conditions, but there we were. But, you know, as we were on approach, and then afterwards, I thought about it a lot. As an aircraft maintenance engineer, you do a lot of calibration checks and such on different instruments. You know, you do airspeed, pitot-static tests, you do radar altimeter tests, you do transponder tests, you do all kinds of different things that you know need to be done right to ensure a safe flight. But honestly, from a maintenance perspective, until you're in the seat and you see how critical it is, it gives you a whole different appreciation for what it is that you do. And I can't help but think that pilots, they have to have a belief every time they get in the aircraft that everything is done right. You know, if somebody had something apart that affects the pitot-static or the air or altitude systems, that they did it appropriately, they did it right, and everything is serviceable. Now, I mean, there's different aspects about this we can talk about, but I have to say also, actually with that same company, we had an aircraft one time that launched off for takeoff, got barreling down the runway, only to find they had no airspeed on one side.
Ooh.
And actually just recently, I've heard of another event, the same thing. They aborted takeoff because they started down the runway and the airspeed, there was a discrepancy in the airspeed. I don't know if they just didn't have any or if it was just too great. Nonetheless, they aborted takeoff. So all of this to say that, you know, how for maintenance providers, how important it is to pay attention to these things, obviously, like you should with anything that you do, right? But, you know, the one incident after this successful landing where the aircraft launched off and had no airspeed on one side, it was an unfortunate situation because the aircraft returned back to base, and of course maintenance got on it, myself, and found that one of the pitot tubes was not connected to the pipe.
Oh.
Under the Canadian aviation regulations, as an engineer, if you have other people doing the work for you or with you, that's acceptable, but you have to inspect the work the way that the regulations read is to the degree necessary. Well, that's very subjective, you know, depending on who you're working with, who did the work. I mean, if you're working with somebody that you've worked with for years and you know their capability, you know their ethics, their like you get an intimacy with the different people you're working with. You don't look at things as closely as you do as you would if it were an apprentice straight out of school that's working on the aircraft. You're not going to leave him alone to do anything because you don't know the work they do. You don't know if they'll take shortcuts. You don't know if they know what they're doing to start with, right? So,
you know, I find very interesting what there is in this story that you just told us about this experience for you to land in a very poor condition, weather condition, with the pilots in the cabin and see how things were running. I find it very interesting because this is one of the points that we are very passionate about. This is why we do what we do. We wrote the book that we wrote, and we do the webinars that we do, because we see this interconnection between flight operations, airworthiness, and maintenance, and how important it is. And I like that you said, you know, the pilots have this belief that somebody in the background did what needed to be done to for the aircraft to be airworthy. And this is, we were just having this discussion this morning, even yesterday we were talking about, and in the webinars we mentioned that the flight begins on the ground.
Right.
And there are a lot of different things. When a person goes to an airport and gets on an aircraft and flies, they just see the aircraft is flying, everything is fine. But there are a lot of steps behind the scenes that take place, and everybody is important and is essential, and it's essential that everybody does what they are supposed to do.
Oh, for sure. And to your point about the flight starts on the ground. So, how do these stories affect flight crew? Well, obviously, aborted flights, the risks, the procedures that have to be followed, all of those things. But even before that, the incident in where the aircraft went barreling down the runway and had no airspeed on one side, that was because the pitot tube was changed out because the pitot tube heat had failed. So in that instance, there would have been a log entry. Part of your pre-departure check is to check the logbook. But I would gather most pilots know that you look at the logbook and get a sense of what's been done since this aircraft last flew, right? So if you see that as a pilot, if I were to see that a pitot-static tube had been replaced, of course there's an entry that had been tested and found to be serviceable, but nonetheless, in the back of your mind, it would register that there's the airspeed indication system has been tampered with. And so there might be just a small part of you that pays slightly more attention to that area on the initial flight out, right? So I think, there's that aspect to it. They have an appreciation that what was done right. And yes, theoretically it should be. Generally, people try to do what's right. And like you say, with human factors, it's not uncommon, it's not unheard of. You can go into Transport Canada website, FAA, EASA websites, reportable events all the time. So these things do happen, and you should never be scared of them, but you should be aware that there's potential in anything where people are.
Yeah, and it's another good point that we talked about, for example, with ferry operators moving transitional aircraft all the time. It's important for them to have a connection with the maintenance and the airworthiness department, whoever is managing the aircraft, so that, for example, if you have to transfer the aircraft on a long route, very long route, if during maintenance they touched some essential primary systems, you should know, so that something happens.
Well, from a maintenance perspective, it's one of the fundamentals of troubleshooting. Is if an airplane comes in with a problem, one of the first things you do is look to see if that system had been worked on prior to the event being reported. Because if it had, there's a good chance that whatever was done may have affected what's happening now, right? So,
in the case of the pitot tube that wasn't connected, do you remember or do you know if again
it was purely human factors?
So what do you do in a case like this? I think it should be reported in the safety management system nowadays.
This was before the days of safety.
Yeah, no, for sure. We are talking about things that happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
But just to give a reference to the people who are watching this, it should be entered in the safety management system so that it can be evaluated and see what caused it, and if the procedures need to be reviewed, training need to be reviewed.
Well, certainly there needs to be transparency.
It's important to report issues like this so they can be evaluated and you can learn about it. Because I remember I worked for a company who was actually doing this. They were using their own mistakes to train all the people inside the company. So this thing happened. So those are the causes, and these are the
absolutely
things that we are putting in place, right?
And I've actually, as a regulator, I've seen that as well, and I actually prefer it as human factors training. For instance, certainly, like you say, you plug it into your SMS and see what you determine the root causes were and all of that good stuff, and try to mitigate it, and that's all one aspect. But even in the light of like human factors training, I've seen a few different organizations do exactly that. They go back over the last 12 months and they say, okay, what mistakes have been reported? What hazards have been identified? And then use those as examples of, okay, these are real life instances where something could have gone wrong. It didn't, perhaps, or maybe it did. but nonetheless, okay, these are lessons that can be learned from it. And to me, that drives home the concept of human factors and the importance of it much better than every 12 months or every 24 months sitting down and going over the dirty dozen. I mean,
for sure.
It's the dirty dozen are there, sure, bring them up, but let's see how this affects reality and how we can deal with it, right?
No, for sure. Yeah, I like the story because it's again, it puts into perspective the different parts that we all play in the aircraft management and flying aircraft scenario. And yeah, I think it's important to have a different perspective. If you guys enjoy Storytime with Bret, check out the other episodes on our YouTube channel, and check out our services on CACglobalsolutions.com, and check out also our podcast. It's called Aviation Perspectives with the C.A.C, and we publish an episode every month. We have one out with the Isle of Man Aircraft Registry. It's a very interesting episode. We talked to the Deputy Director of the Isle of Man Aircraft Registry, Mr. Colin Gill, and he will explain to us how the Isle of Man Aircraft Registry works, the regulation, and the different pieces that have to be in place to manage a M-registered aircraft. So check that out. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Bye.